October 17, 2025. Arizona State Prison Complex, 10:40 in the morning. Richard Jerf breathes his last. He's 55 years old, and he has waited for this moment for 32 long years. But this case is not like most death row stories. Richard didn't kill for money. He didn't kill out of passion, jealousy, or revenge against a stranger. He didn't even act in a fit of rage. Richard Jerf murdered 4 innocent people from the same family. A father, a mother, their 18-year-old daughter, and their 5-year-old son. And why? Over stolen items. An AK-47 rifle and a cassette player. That's all it took to end 4 lives. Richard didn't hide what he did. He didn't feel guilt or remorse at the time. He bragged about it. He told his girlfriend it was really awesome. How does a seemingly simple burglary turn into one of the most horrific massacres in Arizona history? How does someone walk away unscathed while 4 people who had nothing to do with the crime die in agony? These are the questions we will explore today. Before we dive deeper into this dark story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps these true crime stories alive. Richard Kenneth Jerf was born on November 6, 1969, in Phoenix, Arizona. From the very beginning, his life followed a quiet, almost invisible path. If you asked anyone who crossed paths with him, they would all give the same description. Richard was a loner. He didn't socialize much. He didn't have a wide circle of friends, and those who did know him often described him as distant, closed off, someone who kept his life entirely to himself. He moved through the world in silence, observing but never engaging, a man content to exist in his own bubble, separate from the noise of ordinary life. By the early 1990s, Richard had built a small, orderly world around him. He had an apartment, possessions he valued, and a strict daily routine. He worked nights as a custodian at a Safeway supermarket, cleaning floors, taking out trash, and moving silently through the empty aisles while everyone else slept. In this quiet space, he met Albert Luna Jr., a coworker who also worked the night shift. They were acquaintances at first, and for a brief time, Richard considered them friends, or at least companions through long, lonely nights. By January 1993, Richard was 23 years old. His apartment was his sanctuary, filled with personal belongings, including a prized AK-47 rifle and various electronics. One day, he returned home to find that sanctuary violated. Someone had broken into his apartment. But this wasn't random. The intruder knew exactly what to take. The electronic equipment was gone, the cassette player stolen, and most alarmingly, his rifle had vanished. Richard immediately suspected Albert Luna Jr. The man had been inside his apartment before. He knew Richard's belongings, knew the layout, and now, in a single act, had crossed a line that Richard felt could never be forgiven. Richard initially did what most people would do. He called the police, filed a report, and detailed who he thought was responsible. But the legal system moved slowly. Days passed. Weeks passed. Albert Jr. remained free. No one demanded restitution. No one confronted the accused thief. For Richard, each passing day felt like a personal insult, a deepening wound of betrayal. He could not accept that someone he trusted could violate his home and take what was his. The legal system had failed him, or at least that is how he saw it. Weeks turned to months, and Richard's anger fermented into something darker, something more dangerous. He began to obsess, replaying the incident in his mind, imagining all the ways he could regain what he had lost, imagining all the ways he could make Albert Jr. pay. 9 months passed. 9 months of planning, fantasizing, and constructing a revenge in his mind that went far beyond retrieving stolen property. To the outside world, the stolen items were replaceable. A cassette player, some electronics, and a rifle worth a few $100s. But to Richard, the theft was an existential violation. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about respect, betrayal, and a perceived injustice that demanded restitution in the most extreme way he could imagine. Somewhere in those 9 months, his thoughts turned violent, and the scope of his anger expanded. Richard didn't just want to punish Albert Jr., he wanted him to feel the consequences of his actions in the most unimaginable way. And he found the path to revenge in an unexpected place: Albert Jr.'s family. The logic was twisted, the reasoning dark, but in Richard's mind, it made perfect sense. If Albert Jr. could steal from him, then Richard would take from him in return. Not just possessions, but the very people Albert loved. Richard didn't know much about the Luna family. He had never interacted with most of them, but that didn't matter. He meticulously planned an attack that would strike at the heart of what he believed Albert Jr. held dear. In his mind, destroying the family would be punishment, a message that no one could steal from Richard and escape consequences. In Richard's calculation, this was justice and nothing else mattered. On September 14, 1993, Richard Jerf acted. The Luna family lived in a typical Phoenix neighborhood, working class, quiet, trying to live normal lives. Albert Sr. worked long hours, Patricia Luna cared for the household, and their children, including 18-year-old Michelle and 5-year-old Damien, were just living ordinary lives. None of them had any part in the theft that had consumed Richard's mind. Yet, that day, their world would be destroyed. Richard approached the Luna home carrying a vase of artificial flowers, a facade of normalcy, the kind of gesture that would lower anyone's defenses. Patricia Luna, seeing someone with flowers, opened the door, smiling. That smile disappeared instantly when Richard pulled a handgun and forced his way inside. From that moment, terror took hold. Patricia was bound, her movements restricted. Young Damien sat helplessly as the psychological torment began. Richard demanded the whereabouts of Albert Jr., learning he was not home. Most people would have left, waited for another opportunity. Not Richard. He decided the family itself would pay. He forced Patricia to gather electronics from the home, moving items into the garage under threat of death. Then he bound her and Damien to chairs, taped their mouths, and began a torment of fear and indecision. Hours passed. Michelle Luna arrived home, expecting an ordinary afternoon. She walked into a nightmare. Richard grabbed her, gagged her, and led her to her room. What followed was unspeakable. Her life ended violently, but the horror for her family was only beginning. Meanwhile, Albert Sr. returned from work, walking into a scene he could never have imagined. He was captured, beaten with a baseball bat repeatedly, handcuffed, and left for dead. Against all odds, he survived long enough to attempt a heroic counterattack, grabbing a pocket knife, striking Richard, but ultimately succumbing to gunfire. Patricia and Damien were executed immediately afterward. For lives ended in a single day, lives that had done nothing wrong. Richard's actions didn't stop there. He attempted to burn the house down, to destroy evidence, but failed. When confronted later, he lied, claiming a robbery attempt at the mall. The police had no reason to suspect the man they saw injured in the hospital had orchestrated a massacre. It wasn't until days later that his bragging, his own words, led to his arrest. Richard Jerf's case would eventually stretch across decades, involving legal maneuvers, pleas, and appeals. The scope of his crimes, the horrific nature of the murders, and his own pride in them made it one of the most infamous cases in Arizona history. But the tragedy extended beyond Richard, touching the lives of those left behind, particularly Albert Luna Jr., who carried the burden of 4 deaths over something he had done, a theft that was never intended to have such consequences. After the arrest, Richard Jerf's legal journey began. Initially, he was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, each corresponding to a member of the Luna family. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The murder weapons were recovered, stolen items were found in his possession, and forensic evidence tied him directly to the crime scene. What made the case extraordinary, aside from the brutality, was Richard's mindset. He didn't confess out of guilt or remorse. He confessed out of pride. He described the murders in vivid, chilling detail to his girlfriend, calling them awesome, revealing the perverse delight he had taken in each act. The investigation revealed just how meticulously Richard had planned everything. He had stalked the family, studied their routines, and carefully selected the timing of his attack. It was an act of obsession, an expression of vengeance that had been months in the making. The psychological impact on first responders was profound. Officers who entered the Luna home described scenes that would haunt them forever. Blood was everywhere. The family was bound, executed, and some of the horrors inflicted went beyond even the most hardened detective's comprehension. Officer Ernie Britz, who entered the home that night, would later admit he could still recall the scene 32 years later. Even his partner, John, eventually quit the force, unable to cope with the trauma as the legal process unfolded. Richard made a decision that shocked his attorneys. He invoked his right under Rule 11 to represent himself in court. His goal was clear: bypass a full trial and enter a guilty plea. His lawyers warned him that this decision would almost certainly guarantee a death sentence. But Richard insisted, confident in his own understanding of the law. The court had to assess his competency to ensure he was capable of making this choice. Ultimately, he was deemed competent, and the path to self-representation was granted. Richard's case became a teaching point in legal schools, a cautionary tale about self-representation and the dangers of allowing a defendant to bypass experienced counsel. Had he listened to his lawyers, there might have been room to explore mitigating circumstances, mental health defenses, or plea negotiations that could have altered his fate. Instead, he expedited his journey to death row. The plea agreement itself was straightforward yet chilling. Richard pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder. Other charges, rape, kidnapping, attempted arson, were dismissed. The court had evidence for these acts as well, but the plea was designed to avoid a prolonged trial. Even in this moment, Richard seemed detached from reality. He believed pleading guilty could save him from execution, showing a misunderstanding or disregard of the severity of his crimes. On May 22, 1996, Richard Jerf was sentenced. 4 death sentences were handed down, 1 for each life he had taken. The judge's statement was unflinching. Richard had relished his actions. He had enjoyed the murders. And even in the face of such justice, Richard's response revealed a chilling lack of comprehension. "They can only kill me once," he remarked with a smirk. It was a comment that revealed his detachment from the human cost of his actions, a reflection of his narcissism and obsessive need for control. From that point forward, Richard's life became a long series of appeals, delays, and legal maneuvers that extended his time on death row for decades. Initially, his appeal to the Arizona Supreme Court was rejected. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his case. In 2002, he was scheduled for execution, but a stay was issued, postponing the lethal injection. Legal developments, including the landmark Supreme Court ruling in Ring v. Arizona, changed the rules about who could impose the death penalty, creating further delays. Subsequent cases, including Schreier v. Summerlin, contributed to a reshaping of Arizona's death penalty jurisprudence, and Richard's fate was caught in that legal web. Throughout the 32 years between his sentencing and execution, Richard's behavior oscillated between braggadocio and silence. In the early days, he boasted about his murders, sharing the details with friends and displaying the wounds he sustained in a failed defensive attack by Albert Sr. His pride, his lack of remorse, and his attempts to control how others viewed him revealed a disturbing psychology. Yet, as years passed, a shift occurred. By 2025, Richard Jerf had exhausted every legal avenue. His appeals were denied. The courts had rendered their decisions. He was now one of only 20 inmates in Arizona to have fully exhausted all appeals for a capital case. There was nowhere left to turn. The time for his execution had come. Even in his final days, Richard's choices reflected both humanity and horror. He wrote a letter acknowledging his crimes, expressing remorse for the first time in over 3 decades, and explicitly declined to request clemency. It was a letter that could never undo what had been done, but it marked the first acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. Still, the lives lost, Albert Sr., Patricia, Michelle, and Damien, would remain permanently absent. The burden of those deaths rested forever on the living, especially Albert Luna Jr., the man whose theft had set the chain of events in motion. October 17, 2025, arrived. Arizona State Prison Complex, 10:40 a.m. Richard Jerf, now 55, prepared to face the finality that had eluded him for decades. The lethal injection chamber was ready. Staff moved with precision, aware of his history and the notoriety of his crimes. Richard had requested a simple final meal: a double cheeseburger with lettuce, tomato, and onion rings with ketchup, a slice of cherry pie with whipped cream, and a 20-ounce Pepsi with ice. Ordinary comfort food for a man whose actions had caused extraordinary horror. The execution did not proceed smoothly. Richard's veins proved difficult to access. Multiple attempts were required to insert the foreline, prolonging his suffering and testing the resolve of the prison staff. Each failed attempt was a reminder of the human frailty present even in the mechanisms of state-sanctioned death. Finally, at 10:05 a.m., the 4 was successfully placed, and the staff prepared to carry out the sentence. Richard declined to offer final words. After decades of bragging, confessions, and manipulations, he remained silent. There was no defiance, no final boast. The injection began. At 10:40 a.m., Richard Kenneth Jerf was pronounced dead. Deputy Director John Barcelo confirmed the procedure, noting that Richard had cooperated fully, despite the challenges posed by his veins. The aftermath of the execution brought reflections that extended far beyond the man himself. Albert Luna Jr., the catalyst for this horrific sequence of events, remained alive. Yet the cost was immense. His father, Albert Sr., beaten and killed despite a heroic struggle. His mother, Patricia, forced to watch unspeakable acts against her children. His sister, Michelle, brutally murdered, and his little brother, Damien, gone at just 5 years old. For 32 years, Albert Jr. carried the weight of knowing that his actions, a minor theft, had set in motion the deaths of everyone he loved. No restitution, no punishment, no court could ever bring them back. First responders, officers like Ernie Britz and John, bore their own invisible scars. What they witnessed that night was a crime that transcended ordinary human comprehension. Blood, violence, and psychological torment left marks not visible to the eye but permanently etched in their memories. Many refused interviews, unwilling to revisit the trauma. John left the force entirely. Britz still recalls the faces, the positions of the victims, the horror of the Luna home. Even decades later, the images remain vivid. The case serves as a stark example of the destructive potential of obsession, unchecked rage, and the human capacity for cruelty. A stolen cassette player and rifle, worth perhaps $1,000 combined, became the trigger for 4 deaths. The legal system, slow to act on the initial burglary report, inadvertently allowed Richard's fury to fester. His calculated, obsessive planning turned a minor theft into a massacre. Richard Jerf's story is also a lesson in the complexities of capital punishment and legal strategy. His choice to represent himself, to plead guilty quickly, and to reject legal counsel expedited his journey to death row, influencing death penalty jurisprudence in Arizona. His appeals, the Ring versus Arizona decision, and subsequent cases reshaped the rules surrounding capital punishment, affecting not just his fate but the legal framework for future cases. Ultimately, the tragedy is multifaceted. For innocent lives were destroyed. A family was annihilated. First responders and witnesses endured trauma that lasted a lifetime. Albert Luna Jr. lives burdened with guilt and loss for a crime he did not commit. And Richard Jerf, the orchestrator of it all, faced justice only after decades, in the end acknowledging remorse too late to matter to the victims or their surviving relatives. The story leaves questions that linger. How can anger and obsession grow unchecked? When does a desire for justice become an act of monstrous revenge? Could early intervention or timely law enforcement action have prevented the deaths? What responsibility does society bear when small injustices escalate into unimaginable tragedy? In the end, Richard Jerf's life ended quietly, but the echo of his actions reverberates endlessly. For lives lost, a family destroyed, and the lingering weight carried by those who survived serve as a grim reminder of the consequences of rage left unbridled. It is a story of obsession, vengeance, and the fragile boundary between ordinary human grievance and extraordinary violence. Subscribe for more true crime stories that explore how minor betrayals can escalate into horrific tragedies. Cases that reveal the fragile line between revenge and murder and the darkest depths of human obsession.